Somewhere between sunrise and porridge, medieval life lurched into the realm of the truly exhausting. You see, while the grand histories record kings and crusades, treaties and treasons, far less fanfare is given to the astonishing struggles of daily existence. And tonight, we sink into that quieter story, the one with buckets, bread, bells, and endless blisters. Let us begin on a slow-turning morning in a small English village in the mid-14th century. A rooster, a bird eternally overconfident in its role, has crowed atop someone's thatched roof, declaring the day open for business. The cottage beneath it shudders with life, not gracefully. A woman named Elswyth, who might be 30 but looks 52, thanks to smoke and hard cheese, groans as her joints protest the very idea of motion. She slept with 2 of her 6 children wedged against her, one of whom has stolen the warmer half of the wool blanket. The thatch above them leaks lightly, the sort of drizzle that's been happening indoors for weeks now, but no one mentions it, as acknowledging it would make it feel more real. And besides, the rains don't listen. Her day begins not with tea or meditation, but with scraping dried oats off a pot from yesterday. This is breakfast preparation. Oats, nearly always oats. If medieval villagers had had Instagram, their feed would have just been spoon after spoon of grim grey porridge, filtered only by chimney soot. Bread, if available, it's the brown, crunchy variety with the occasional pebble surprise. Teeth were notably pessimistic in this era, and while we're here, teeth. The word dentist was less a profession and more an abstract wish. Your average medieval mouth was a crumbling shrine to barley, salted fish, and poor choices. Toothaches were so common, they were almost treated as personality traits. Getting dressed is more about layering the same woolen tunics, adjusting the same itchy hood, and swatting away the same incredibly bold lice. Fashion in medieval villages was not about making a statement, unless that statement was, "I haven't bathed in February." Now, before the rooster's encore, the village is stirring. Not that the villagers want to stir. Stirring is exhausting, but life demands it. The animals bleat with uncaffeinated urgency. Cows require milking before they explode or plot something sinister. Chickens scream like they've paid taxes. Pigs are already in some minor argument with a child over territory in the yard. A goose stares at Elswyth with suspicious intensity. Geese, as seasoned historians will tell you, were the undisputed villains of the Middle Ages. Then the church bell rings, not melodiously. No think iron migraine echoing across wooden fences. Bells signaled everything. Prayer, danger, plague, time to harvest, time to pretend you're praying, time to wonder if the bell ringer ever stops to consider how loud he is. Elswyth sighs. Time for prayers and pond water, not necessarily in that order. She leaves the cottage and walks to the village well. But between her door and the well is a minefield of gossip. Bertred next door eyes Elswyth with the steely gaze of one who knows that someone walked across the barley field too early last month. Suspicion blooms fast where privacy is limited. Any sneeze could birth a rumour, and any limp might mean you're halfway to death. Or worse, just being dramatic. Fetching water is a perilous ballet of slipping on mud and fighting off neighbourhood children who treat the bucket like a toy. By the time Elswyth returns to her cottage, one of the children has filled his shoes with goat droppings and tracked them heroically across the dirt floor. At this point, the dirt floor might actually be cleaner than the shoes. Meanwhile, her oldest son, Wulfric, is already heading toward the fields. Wulfric, 15, but aged with the wisdom of someone who's fallen into cow muck every week of his life. His job today, everything. Everyone's job today is everything. Being a peasant meant mastering at least 7 trades before breakfast. Farmer, carpenter, thatcher, brewer, midwife in a pinch, constable if no one else shows up, and of course, dung relocator. But don't imagine medieval folks saw this as bleak. They didn't know different. Life was communal, even if the community fought like an extended family at a garden feast with only one serving of pie. They gathered, shared, worked, and squabbled in equal measure. All of this to say, simply staying alive was the hardest job in Europe. And yet, they did. And as night would return, hallucinated through exhaustion or moonlight, villagers like Ellsworth would collapse into straw-stuffed mattresses, sometimes with chickens for warmth and sometimes just because a chicken was already there. It's in these soft hours just before candle snuff and dreams that we begin to truly honor their resilience. If these stories help you drift off, please subscribe to the channel. It would mean the world to me. And before you fully fade into dreamland, I would love to know where you're listening from and what time it is there. Now, rest your eyes. The bells are quiet for now, and the porridge will wait till morning. By the flickering glow of a tallow candle, and under the suspicious watch of a half-awake goose, medieval daily life marched on, or at least shuffled clumsily forward like someone wearing borrowed shoes made of wood and existential dread. While kings plotted and knights preened, the common folk were kept firmly grounded, largely because their shoes were full of mud and held together with hope and pig sinew. Let us begin with something truly thrilling. Water. Yes, water. That transparent menace, both life-giving and, in the Middle Ages, almost professionally committed to making you ill. The average villager in, say, 14th century England drank water only slightly more often than they read Latin poetry. It wasn't because they were too busy, though plucking feathers off a chicken one by one does take time. It's because the well water was often a GoFundMe for bacteria. Rivers were pretty, yes, but also popular spots for laundering clothes, washing bodies, and relieving oneself when nature called during a particularly long butter churn. Instead, most people drank ale. Weak ale, to be fair, lovingly referred to as small beer, a beverage so mild it was safer than a deep breath. Children, pregnant women, and that old man who always smelled faintly like onions, all drinking beer all day long. It sterilized the water and conveniently made your daily toil slightly less soul-eating. When your morning started with cold feet and communal goats, a pint or two took the edge off. Now, about that daily toil. Imagine waking each day with the sun, or more accurately, with whatever noise the rooster decided to make in your thatch-roofed bedroom. Roosters, it should be noted, were never consulted about humane hours of labor. They screamed when they pleased. Your day began not with coffee and podcasts, but with a scratch from a straw mattress and a deep internal sigh that sounded a lot like, "Not again." Work divided among men, women, and children like a very unfair game of chance. Men ploughed fields with heavy wooden tools and heavier senses of futility, pushing through soils that often yielded more rocks than food. Women, meanwhile, were miracle manufacturers, baking bread, spinning wool, milking goats, brewing ale, raising children, making soap, and, if time allowed, flourishing in interpretive sighing. Children got involved early. By the age of 7, you could be pulling weeds or carrying water, which is to say, training for your Olympic event in lifelong field labor. Time was measured less by the ticking of clocks. They were luxury items and, frankly, too hard to fit in one's pocket, and more by bells. Church bells, work bells, breakfast and vespers and mournful tolls for a neighbour you saw just yesterday carrying a suspicious rash. Life had a rhythm, but not a relaxing one. A sort of tragic jazz. Meals were humble affairs. Bread, porridge, and if you were lucky, some root pretending to be a vegetable. Protein came in the form of salted meats or the occasional fish that had, one assumes, heard the word fresh only in passing. Taste was not the point. Survival was. Medieval cooks seasoned with herbs, but also a fair bit of desperation. Hygiene was a famously elusive creature in the Middle Ages, like bath time with Bigfoot. While people didn't love being filthy, they were also keenly aware that water could betray them, so cleanliness was achieved through wiping, scraping, and the cunning use of lye soap that quite possibly moonlighted as paint stripper. Communal bathhouses existed in towns, occasionally doubling as innocent social centres and, allegedly, not so innocent hookups. A steaming hot bath with your neighbour's friend, and 2 wandering minstrels. What could be more refreshing? Personal space was a luxury reserved for saints and cats. Homes were typically one room, and that room served as kitchen, bedroom, lounge, and minor poultry sanctuary. Beds were shared, often with multiple family members, and in particularly chilly months, perhaps even with animals. It's hard to romanticize medieval marriage when you picture both partners huddled beneath damp woolen blankets, while a chicken pecks curiously at their toes. Yet, even in all the hardship, laughter found a gap in the wattle and daub walls. Stories were told, songs were sung, and festivals were how peasants reminded themselves there was more to life than mud and taxes. There were dance-fueled midsummers, boar-feasting Yuletides, and that one guy who always turned up with a lute and questionable morals. And with bellies somewhat full and muscles thoroughly exhausted, villagers would return to their beds of straw, listening to the snore of a sleeping pig, or the wind rattling shutters made of old wood and hopeful prayer. By then, the candle would have sputtered out, and the only light left would be the moon brushing gently against the thatch, guarding old secrets as barefoot children dreamed of bread with actual flavour. Somewhere on the edge of sleep, and somewhere between the baked mud floor and the heavens above, trouble was brewing. Not the usual kind found in stewpots and gossip, but the kind you'll hear about soon enough, when daily life took a turn for the peculiarly personal. In the rare moments when no one was dumping chamber pots out their windows or accusing their neighbours of consorting with woodland spirits, medieval townsfolk had a curious obsession with timekeeping, despite not really knowing what time it was. You see, in our modern age of digital clocks and streaming schedules, we rather take for granted the idea that 7 a.m. means the same thing whether you're in Toledo, Tokyo, or your bed, snoozing for the 3rd time. But in medieval Europe, time was more of a vague suggestion, like your cousin's promise to definitely pay you back. Let us wander into a sleepy 14th century village now. It's dawn, or at least we think it is. Some rooster has crowed, a bell has tolled, and a very particular monk is hunched in a stone tower squinting at the shadow cast by a pole and muttering, yes, definitely tierce, or none. Monastic timekeeping, also known as the divine office, divided the day into sections hinged more on religious ritual than on, say, your boss yelling across the castle, "Where's the report, Cedric?" Monks prayed at matins, lauds, prime, terce, sext, none, vespers, and compline, which sounds suspiciously like the world's dampest law firm. In towns, life followed a similarly squishy pattern. The bells of the local church provided the closest thing to a public clock, tolling out the times for daily labor, prayer, and alleged rest. Though if you lived above the tannery, rest mostly involved inhaling pungent leather fumes and wondering what fresh reek tomorrow might bring. Oh, and speaking of bells, their ringing was not standardized. So when the bell rang for Vespers in one village, the next village over might be merrily halfway through Sext, blissfully unaware that the saints were already frowning at their tardiness. This time, drift could mean missing church, or, more catastrophically, arriving to market after the pies had cooled, a tragedy from which few medieval hearts could recover. For peasants working the land, bless their weather-beaten souls, time was felt more through sweat and sunlight than by any reckoning of the hours. The workday began when you could see enough to swing a scythe without harvesting your own foot, and ended when it was too dark to tell your turnips from your children. This unscheduled chaos suited some just fine, but for officials keeping tax ledgers, chaos was not a preferred unit of account. As cities grew, so did the desire for, shall we say, punctuality. And so, the town clock was born, a solution to the highly medieval problem of needing to tell time without having any watches. Watches not having been invented, and sundials being mostly smug and useless on cloudy days. The earliest mechanical clocks appeared in the late 13th century, whirring and clicking with an enthusiasm far outpacing their accuracy. Early versions were so imprecise that entire hours could vanish or appear out of nowhere, causing considerable confusion and the occasional unplanned wedding. Imagine a town council arguing whether it was appropriate to behead someone at nones, only for the clock to chime matins, causing the executioner to throw up his hands and say, "Well now, I've lost the mood entirely." Still, the clockmakers pressed on, fueled by divine mission and what must have been buckets of patience. Over time, yes, pun, delightful and intended, the public clock became a symbol of civic pride. To have a bell tower with a bell that actually rang roughly when it ought to was to say, "We are a prosperous town. Look, time leaks from us at a slower pace than from others." And their presence subtly changed how people conceived of their day. Hours became rigid dividers of work, meals, prayer, and ale. A man late to market could now be scolded not just by the priest, but by cold bronze ringing overhead. Time had shifted from something sensed in your bones to something dictated by gears and bells. And while this helped many things, trade, communication, not missing your medieval dentist appointment, it also brought a new anxiety, the creeping, ticking pressure of being behind schedule. Time was no longer yours. It belonged to the bell tower. It's rather poetic, really, that an invention meant to bring order quietly introduced whole new ways for people to feel overwhelmed. A lesson in medieval innovation. Progress may help you tell time, but it can't promise you'll enjoy knowing it. Let the bells fade now into a low, humming fog across the village rooftops. Beyond the clock tower, beyond the fields, another daily ordeal was whispering into life. Imagine the smell of boiled turnips wafting through a drafty thatched roof cottage, a place where the warmth from the hearth was less comforting, and more of a strategic advantage against the frosty fingers of an unsympathetic winter. In such a setting, daily life in the medieval world was not so much a routine as a game of delightful, relentless inconvenience. You see, while royalty plotted leagues and bishops hollered about sin and soup recipes indistinguishably, the average villager had more pressing concerns, like surviving laundry day. For a task as seemingly mundane as washing clothes, Your average medieval peasant had to battle muddy stream banks, icy water, and the unpredictable temperament of lye soap, which had the curious habit of either bleaching your shift or dissolving it altogether. Clothes, mind you, weren't washed all that often, partly because most people only had one set. That's right, one, as in singular. The same tunic for feasting, farming, flirting, and funerals. Versatility was apparently invented long before the Swiss Army knife. Bathing followed a similar schedule of whenever we remember, if at all. Medieval people, to their credit, weren't as entirely allergic to cleanliness as some stereotype peddling textbooks would have you believe. Public bathhouses existed in many towns, where people would immerse themselves in warm water while discussing everything from harvest rumors to the king's latest petition to invade someone. Again. But then came the Black Death, and bathhouses earned a suspicious reputation for spreading not just gossip, but plague. Suddenly scrubbing up was considered borderline flirtatious and vaguely suspicious. Clean people were obviously hiding something. Then we come to teeth. Dental hygiene in the medieval age was a rather poetic exercise in futility. Charcoal and sage were early toothbrushes, and rinsing with wine was not entirely discouraged. To be fair, many peasants had surprisingly decent teeth, at least until sugar became popular. After that, things inside one's mouth took a dramatic and crunchy turn for the worse. By the time nobles had teeth worthy of a particularly dramatic horror story, villagers were still gamely gnawing through rye bread, with molars made of sheer determination. Food, in many ways, summed up daily life with delicious inefficiency. The medieval menu was dominated by whatever wasn't currently trying to escape. Barley bread, porridge, onions, leeks, these were reliable staples. Meat appeared less frequently in most diets, unless you were nobility or happened to be really skilled with a slingshot and didn't mind evading the local lord's reeves. Poaching, while technically illegal, was also extremely delicious. But meals weren't just battles against blandness. They were strategic negotiations with time and spoilage. Without refrigeration, your options were smoke it, salt it, or eat it before it tells you its name. This is where pottage shone, a bubbling, forever stew that lived in a cauldron and was rarely emptied, only topped off. It acquired flavor in the same way castles acquired ghosts, gradually, unpredictably, and sometimes with surprising results. Meanwhile, time itself was a very loose concept. For your average villager, morning started when the rooster did, even if he was wrong, and evening ended when the last candle guttered out like a miniature sun conceding defeat. The sun was your clock, the church bells your snooze button, and seasonal festivals your only sense of a calendar. Frankly, it was a rhythm guided more by livestock than logic. Still, there was a strange and cozy beauty in the chaos. Fields followed the ancient pulse of plough and harvest. Families gathered close in the warmth of dwindling firelight, and gossip served as both entertainment and emergency news service. Did you hear the miller saw a ghost in the barley field? No, but the blacksmith's wife says it was just old Thomas sleepwalking again. And all the while, through the endless chores, the questionable cuisine, and the eternally mysterious stains, medieval life rolled on, not with grace perhaps, but certainly with style, or at least a stubborn sort of rhythm, a kind where the collapse of everything was just Tuesday. Now, let us drift from the clamour of the cook fire and the itchy woolen tunics, slipping gently into the next quiet corner of this world, where something as simple as a shoe could spark a full-blown existential crisis. Yes, truly, footwear was no walk in the park. As twilight settles over the patchwork fields of medieval England, we slip quietly into the heart of a village where roofs are thatched, pigs roam free range in the most literal sense, and the distant toll of the abbey bell is the medieval version of a push notification. In this quaint little world of candlelight and codfish, there existed a dangerous thing, something feared, dreaded, and spoken of only in hushed tones around the fire. It was laundry day. Yes, the battle against dirt stared them in the face, and frankly, usually won. Clothing in the Middle Ages was often worn until it became more of a suggestion than a garment. Thanks to wool being the fabric of the every man and every woman, most peasants went through life sheathed in a permanent scratchiness that somehow retained both body heat and, regrettably, body odor. Washing these garments was no small affair. It meant hauling water, making lye from ashes, soaking clothes in suspiciously brown rivers, then beating them senseless on rocks like you had a personal vendetta against cloth. And therein lay the risk. The rivers were cold. Laundry, rocks were slippery and existentially indifferent to the hopes and bones of those who used them. A single misstep, and suddenly you were wet, bruised, and still covered in whatever bread soot had fused itself to your only tunic. Fever could follow, and then, well, one fewer person to pass the wash bucket to. But of course, laundry was just the tip of the grubby, lice-infested iceberg. In daily medieval existence, cleanliness was less a virtue and more a vague memory. Not for lack of wanting, mind you, many people actually liked being clean, or at least clean adjacent. Bathing houses were once a popular pastime across Europe, with hot water, music, and even joint tubs. Unfortunately, like most good things in medieval life, bathing eventually got tangled up in allegations of sin, scandal, and syphilis. Public bathhouses, once resplendent with steam and surprisingly cheerful nudity, were often linked to brothels. Thus, down came the church's disapproving eyebrow. Bathing became suspect. Monks preached that frequent washing might smudge the soul, or worse yet, lead to vanity, and vanity could lead to dancing, and dancing to smiling, and smiling to doom. So rather than risk divine disfavor or public nudity during Lent, many began to forego bathing entirely. It's no wonder perfumes were so popular. By the late 14th century, people were dabbing rose water behind their ears and hoping no one would guess that their last bath had occurred before the lunar eclipse of the year before last. But it wasn't just hygiene that tripped up communities. Consider fire, man's great ally and eternal hazard. With open hearths in wooden homes, fire was always a flick away from devouring entire villages. Chimneys didn't become common in ordinary households until the late Middle Ages, so smoke had to find its own way out, usually through holes in the roof, which doubled as quaint invitations for rain and birds. Cooking meant crouching near flame beside wooden beams, wooden chairs, and if you were lucky, a wooden cat tower for your mouse-chasing companion. One careless ember, and poof. Goodbye cabbage stock, hello town-wide rebuild effort. In some towns, strict laws were established forcing residents to extinguish fires at sunset. That's actually where the phrase curfew comes from. Old French, couvre-feu, meaning cover the fire. Not a bedtime curfew then, but a bedtime for flames. And then there were the floors. Forget marble tiles or squeaky hardwood. Your average medieval home had a floor made of beaten earth. This is, of course, a polite term for a finely curated mix of dirt, old food, pig droppings, and optimism. But a simple dirt floor wasn't simple for long. Families tried to improve it with layers of straw and rushes, which in theory absorbed spills, odours and misfortunes. However, without regular changing, which almost never happened, the layers turned into miniature compost heaps. Mixed in you'd find dog, bones, broken combs, dead rats, and discarded secrets. It was a floor you didn't so much walk upon as negotiate with. Worse still, flammable straw floors lying beside open fires under thatched roofs practically screamed, "This house is practicing to be a bonfire." So we see, daily life in these humble communities was a constant balancing act between maintaining decorum and dodging dysentery, between mending tunics and slipping on your own rushes. Survival teetered on the edge of ordinary. But even amid such chaos, there was something enduring. Rituals, routines, and the gentle rhythm of manageable misfortune. And somewhere behind a creaky wooden door, someone was preparing for another perilous task of great consequence and greater danger. They were about to cook dinner. It began, as so many medieval misfortunes did, with laundry. Now, imagine for a moment that you are a peasant in 13th century England. You've just survived the turnip shortage of spring. Your thatched roof has mostly withstood the devilish whims of springtime rains. And your neighbour finally stopped singing Gregorian chants while mucking out his hogs. Life is, by all medieval standards, blissfully uneventful. That is, until the weekly wash. You see, medieval communities had a complicated relationship with cleanliness, keen in theory, rather spotty in practice. Clothes were washed infrequently, mostly because heating water was a luxury right up there with dining on poultry more than once a year. And even if you wanted to be clean, the idea of soap was still in its avant-garde phase. Most villagers used lye, a charming substance derived from wood ash and water, which doubled as a cleaning agent and a skin removal philosophy. The washing itself usually took place at the village stream, which, tragically, was also where livestock came to drink, children came to splash, and certain very specific sins were confessed sotto voce when the confessional line at church got too long. This made every wash day a gamble. Would your tunic come out cleaner, or just be blessed with a fresh bouquet of mystery germs and spiritually ambiguous eel slime? It wasn't just the risk to fabrics, of course. A trip to the communal water source was a social affair, and much like modern office kitchens, fraught with unspoken rules. There might be eye contact, brief but loaded. Remarks about stains were whispered with biting glee. And God help the soul who dared to encroach upon another woman's washing rock. That was nearly as bad as moving someone's ale mug at the tavern. Almost a declaration of war. But here's the secret historians rarely explore in textbooks. It wasn't just about laundry. These allegedly mundane activities, soap tunics, simmering stews, sweeping rushes from floorboards, were the structural framework of not just homes, but of the community's entire psychological health. And as with all frameworks, when cracked, things could collapse in dramatic, sluggish, yeasty fashion. Take, for example, the much-feared syndrome of community mildew. Oh yes, not an actual disease, mind you, but a term we've lovingly coined here for when a sequence of damp weeks, failed firewood drying, and improperly aired woolens led to an entire community smelling faintly of old sponge and farmer's regret. Spirits would slump. Gossip lost its zest. Even the town goose, typically the energetic ringleader of mid-morning honking sessions, slouched in feathered apathy. Such was the power of seemingly little things. When daily routine soured, so too did morale. Life in close quarters left little space for resolution. A pot left unwashed could mean neighbours falling out for years. A dropped bread crust blamed on one family's scrawny goat might escalate into an inter-house feud, complete with passive-aggressive haystack arrangements. And yet, they persevered, because while the laundry was eternal, so were the tiny comforts. The way sunlight glinted off a clean copper kettle on a good afternoon. The satisfying thunk of your neighbour's head smacking the low lintel he always forgot about, which provided brief but treasured amusement. Life was hard, yes, but also laced with a simple rhythm, a song of soot and soup and the awkward grace of shared humanity. Communities sometimes frayed, yes, but the threads of daily life also stitched them back together, one poorly scrubbed tunic at a time. And sometimes it wasn't water or mud or mildew that risked unraveling the delicate threads of sanity. Sometimes it was bread, but not the bread you're thinking of. Not delightful sourdough or that rustic rye tucked into artisan baskets. No, dear listener, next comes the tale of bread so toxic, so utterly rebellious, it sparked hallucinations, hysteria, and on occasion, spontaneous dance marathons in the gentle, smudged edges of medieval memory. Before streetlights or Google Maps, navigating daily chores required not only a sturdy pair of shoes, but also a mild sense of existential bravery. Life back then had a kind of quiet ambition, not to conquer the world, but simply to survive long enough to complain about bread crusts and cold feet. Nowhere was this more obvious than in the curious case of medieval laundry. Picture this. It's a drizzly Wednesday in the year 1374. Margaret, a washerwoman in the village of Fiddle-under-Thatch, is halfway through scrubbing Lord Pembleton's linen brays in a bucket of icy stream water. They've been soiled by what she kindly refers to as the enthusiastic optimism of a man who thinks leeks are a meal. She is whacking them rhythmically against a wooden paddle, while muttering a mixture of hymn lyrics and the Middle English equivalent of "this job does not pay enough." In medieval towns, laundry was less a matter of hygiene and more a public work of performance art. Since soap was rare, expensive, and suspiciously foreign, the French were involved. Most people washed their clothes with lye, made from ash, or simply soaked them in urine. Yes, fermented human urine. Collecting it was a popular side hustle, and some towns even had street barrels labelled for pee only. We are not making this up. The ammonia broke down grease, but also presumably neighbourly goodwill. As you might imagine, this chemical warfare in the name of cleanliness meant the village laundry site was an aromatic affair. Children were strictly forbidden from poking their noses into the wash house, though it hardly mattered, as they had sniffed once and learned their lesson. But don't mistake these pungent basins for dull corners of communal toil. No. The laundry bench was the Twitter feed of the day, filled with gossip, scandal, and highly subjective fabric reviews. Margaret and her colleagues knew everything. Who kept visiting the blacksmith with no horses, whose woolen hose showed signs of mysterious wear, who suddenly had lace, embroidery stitched by an unfamiliar hand, lace being the 14th century equivalent of an unsolicited text message. Still, even with the steaming laundry gossip and the warmth of shared suffering, this constant wet labour could wear on a person. The effort to remain clean, or even vaguely unsmelly, was such a heroic endeavour that people often just didn't. And it wasn't only individuals giving up. Monks, famed for their ascetic lifestyle and aggressive self-denial, were also not big fans of soap. Many monasteries advised bathing only a few times a year, unless illness or demonic possession made it necessary. This lack of initiative often led to communal outbreaks of something delightfully medieval sounding, like St. Mary's Itch or the Red Rumble. Indeed, the communal wash was both a bonding ritual and a quiet trial by linen. Through smudged afternoons of wringing and nose-gagging, village folk stitched delicate social contracts. You didn't mention the time I shrank your tunic, and I won't mention the stain you pretend is wine. These unspoken codes were upheld more securely than half the local guild bylaws. But laundry had its dangers too. In some towns, water rights were zealously guarded, leading to whimsical feuds between neighbouring hamlets who both claimed ownership of a particularly frothy bend in the nearby river. Court records show cases titled things like "Re, the unlawful soaking of Darnley stockings," or "The matter of the stolen soap route," which were treated with the sincerity we now reserve for international trade agreements. And as if medieval laundry life weren't already taxing enough, it eventually attracted the attention of the moral crusaders. Preachers warned against communal washing areas as places of womanly temptation, though their concern seemed less with temptation itself and more with women daring to socialize freely while elbow deep in someone else's undergarments. So yes, doing the laundry could ruin a day, ruin relationships, and, on occasion, spark actual territorial conflict. But as the sun slipped behind the thatched rooftops and the steam from the sudsy brown water mixed with the scent of wet wool and humility, people found something ancient and familiar: the strange satisfaction of finishing a thankless task together. And as Margaret carried the last stiffened smock home beneath the bruised sky, her hands raw but her mind filled with stories, the stream sighed its own soft news, whispering downstream toward tomorrow's chores. And speaking of chores, best met with an empty stomach. What really was for dinner? Certainly not what you're thinking. Let's drift there next. Quietly now. By the time the rooster crowed in a medieval village, though let's be honest, roosters don't keep clocks and often crowed at whatever hour bugged the neighbours most. The day had already quietly declared war on the average peasant, not in a dramatic sword-swinging way, but in the slow, subtle creep of mundane calamities. And at the front lines of this battle stood the laundry. Yes, laundry. That timeless force of entropy that made even the hardiest of medieval souls question the meaning of life and the texture of wool. While nobility might have occasionally sent their undergarments away with a discreet nod and a servant willing to brave the soap cauldron, your everyday peasant was locked in mortal combat with dirty tunics and muddy hose. The washing process was a Sisyphean event, hauling buckets of water from the local stream, boiling said water with ashes or soapwort, scrubbing shirts over rocks until your knuckles resembled weathered stone, then drying everything on hedges or lines strung between grimy thatched walls. By the time the clothes were clean, the washer was unwell. And yet, laundry was just the beginning. The simple task of staying clean, or even just reasonably non-lethal to one's own nostrils, was a full-time affair. Without indoor plumbing, baths weren't taken casually. You didn't just announce, "I'm going to take a bath," unless you wanted to be laughed out of the village or accused of sinfully pampering yourself. Baths were social, steamy affairs, often conducted in communal town bathhouses, when they existed. Or more often, people bathed only occasionally, when the moon was right and the neighbours supportive. The famous trope that medieval folk hated baths is exaggerated, but definitely rooted in some very fragrant truth. Washing your hair more than once a fortnight was considered odd, and washing your hands before dinner was considered optional, depending on whether you'd been mucking out the pig pen or just harrowing the fields with your bare hands. Then, of course, there was the eternal woe of the latrine, or the thrilling lack thereof. Rural households might have a privy, which was a small wooden hut perched heroically over a pit. It was, let's say, intimate with the seasons. In the summer, you discovered new species of insects. In the winter, you questioned your life choices. And in cities, well, things were worse. Fasten your dreams to this: chamber pots, glorified buckets, and yes, the unfortunate habit of emptying them into the street, out the window, with a cheerful cry of "Gardlou," a phrase which loosely translates to "duck for your life," coupled with the medieval belief that gravity only applies to other people. Hygiene was less a personal virtue and more of an optimistic rumour. Of course, not all was chaos. There were clever attempts at order. Tanners, those brave souls who worked with hides, knew cleanliness was vital, which is why they used urine, human urine, to soften the leather. Entire collections of household pee were gathered for this noble purpose. Can you imagine the family pot by the door, filling slowly over the week, destined for someone's fine pair of boots? Each part of the day was actually a quiet, logistical miracle. Meals, water, lighting, every act required effort. The midday meal could take all morning to prepare, and the evening one involved either reheating what little was left or developing a very sudden affection for turnips. Candles were scarce, so evenings were brief, dark, and full of mystery. Or sleep. Mostly sleep, unless you were wealthy enough to afford beeswax, in which case you could read, or more likely, hear someone else read, by its sweet-smelling flicker. And amidst all the mud, soot, and unwashed hair, people still fell in love. They sang songs, debated field rotations, argued over who owned which goat, and carved little hearts into the beams of their drafty cottages. It was not a hygienic paradise, but it was human. Endearingly, hilariously human. So yes, daily life offered no shortage of hazards. Not the sword kind, but the kind that slowly wore you down, through chafing, rash, or the eternal torment of a neighbour who practiced the hurdy-gurdy, badly by candlelight. But sometimes, if you happened to glance up from the washtub or the dung heap, you'd spot the stars, glinting softly over the thatched rooftops. And for a brief, breathless second, you might almost think the world smelled like night air instead of boiled cabbage and damp wool. Now, let us gently wander onward, away from the slap of wet linen and the bubbling ash soap, to something a little less aromatic and a touch more musical. In the hush of a medieval evening, as the sun dipped behind haphazard thatched rooftops and chimney smoke curled like sleepy dragons, villagers retreated indoors to begin one of the least exciting yet most perilous parts of their routine: surviving their own homes. You see, while castles got all the cinematic attention, with their drawbridges and suspicious moats, most people in medieval Europe couldn't afford even a single tower, let alone a fully armed parapet. No, the average person lived in something far humbler, a blend between a garden shed and a smokehouse, but with fewer windows and more accidents waiting to happen. Picture this: a one-room cottage with a fire pit in the middle of the floor, a few rickety stools around it like a council of wobbly gnomes, and a stray chicken or two wandering in because, well, doors were more suggestions than barriers. No ceiling vents, no chimneys, just an open roof hole that, with any luck, didn't forget to let the smoke out before winter came in. Living in such conditions was how early medieval folk invented the phrase "coughing up a lung," otherwise known as accidental house smoking. The heavy smoke from indoor fires blackened the walls, tarred the lungs, and seasoned the stew all at once. It's not that they didn't want chimneys, it's just that chimneys were newfangled technology, and nothing invited skepticism in a medieval village, quite like a hole in your house that you wanted the weather to go through. Now, while these homes may sound, let's say, rustic, they were actually marvels of multifunctionality. During the day, your single room served as a cooking area, workshop, and meeting space. At night, it became sleeping quarters for the whole family, sometimes extended family, and on occasion, the family pig. Not out of affection, mind you. The pig doubled as an early security system and late winter dinner. Sleep arrangements were decided not by comfort, but by proximity to the fire, and unfortunately, the airing armpits of Uncle Godfrey. Mattresses, if you were lucky enough to have such a thing, were little more than lumpy sacks of straw that poked you into good posture. Privacy, meanwhile, was an unknown luxury. If someone wanted a moment alone, say to be dramatic or practice lewd soliloquies, they'd have to invent errands like going to check if the turnips are still turnips. Personal space was quite simply a myth, right up there with spontaneous dental hygiene and unclogged outhouses. Which brings us neatly and delicately to medieval sanitary practices, or the art of gently pretending filth wasn't everywhere. Without indoor plumbing, people relied on chamber pots, which were emptied with the grace and aim of a toddler flinging soup. Streets doubled as open-air drains, which made walking home after dark something of an obstacle course. Even shoes couldn't always save you. Many simply wore wooden platforms, essentially medieval stilts, but these were rarely graceful. A tumble in the dark often meant waking up with nothing bruised but your dignity, and perhaps an unfortunate side of fermented mud. During cold seasons, one might imagine that everyone retired early, tucked in with a good manuscript. Not quite. Books were as rare as quiet babies, and literacy still hadn't made its rounds to the masses. Instead, families entertained themselves with songs, riddles, or questionable tales from someone who swore their cousin's cousin once saw a dragon in the woods. Perhaps they were just describing Geoffrey the shepherd after a suspicious mushroom stew. But no one was about to interrupt once the firelight was dancing on the walls and the story had taken flight. Some evenings were lit with flickering rushlights, simple candles made of animal fat and reeds. These smelt awful, burned erratically, and were exclusively responsible for about 500 singed eyebrows annually. Yet they cast a warm, hobbit-esque glow across soot-streaked beams and clay walls, cradling the darkness like an old friend. In this world of dense smoke, close quarters, and wildly ambitious pigs, daily life indoors was less a haven and more of a slow brewing battle of adaptation. And yet, against damp corners and creeping lung conditions, these homes fostered strong communities, whether you liked it or not. Living cheek to jowl had a peculiar way of forcing cooperation, or at least the polite exchange of fleas. But the walls weren't the only thing that closed in come nightfall. As the wind whispered through crooked shutters and the hearth's last embers glowed like sleepy eyes, another threat approached, not from outside, but from within the very structure medieval folk trusted most with their weary bones. For in the quiet hours before dawn, amid dreams of hearth and harvest, rose the peril of thatched roofs, and what occasionally lived in them, beneath the echo of cathedral bells and the musty aroma of damp stone. A danger quietly brewed in medieval towns and villages. Not dragons or invaders, those at least made dramatic entrances. No, this was something far subtler and much more cunning. Its name, everyday chore-based disintegration, the grand unravelling of society, one missing bucket of water, cracked shoe sole, or broken cheese mould at a time. Let us drift now to the edge of a small English hamlet, say somewhere near the River Ouse, where ducks laughed uncontrollably at their own jokes, and people did not have the luxury of personal hygiene or central plumbing or socks that matched. Not that they'd want them to. Matching was suspicious. Here, in the pause between sunrise and responsibility, we meet the medieval laundress. Her name is Edith, and she knows two things for certain: that soap is expensive, and that river kelp is an untrustworthy cleaning agent. She rises early, sleeves heavy with dew, and trudges down to the water with a basket of clothing that smells like goat's ambition. Now, one might picture this as peaceful work. Cool breezes, lapping water, birdsong. But as Edith dunks tunics into the river and slaps them with a wooden baton, she is waging a quiet war. Washing clothes meant pulling your entire body's worth of muscle in a battle against dried-on porridge, ale stains, and the constant insult of medieval fabrics, most of which seemed determined to resist freshening at all costs. The washing process was more dangerous than you'd think. Rivers were slippery, eels were grabby, and if your scrubbing stone fell in, your entire week was ruined. Villages risked disharmony when local washerwomen developed competitive streaks, creating bubbles of passive-aggressive laundering politics. Oh, did Mary use lye again? Bold choice, for someone who likes holes in her tunics. Elsewhere, the task of fetching water, long considered the Olympic sport of the underappreciated, was carried out by young boys and girls with impossibly small legs and disproportionately large pails. Spill too much and you'd face your mother's wrath. Spill nothing and people might assume you had witchcraft in your bones. There was no winning, just damp socks and general suspicion. Water itself was both precious and peculiar. Though used for bathing, it was often mistrusted in its raw form, especially in towns queasily downstream from someone else's bath time. Beer, ale, and thin gruel were far safer to drink than the shared river, which by mid-afternoon resembled lukewarm stew. People talked more freely to their beer than to their physicians, so it might not surprise you that communities broke down not from wars or feuds, but from chronic logistical fatigue. A missed bread delivery, a borrowed pitcher not returned, or someone using your drying line without permission. These were the true incursions. Even firewood distribution sparked civil unrest. The woodcutter's apprentice, Sebald, a boy who always looked like he was about to confess to something, had once distributed damp kindling on laundry day. The village remembered, for years. There goes Sebald, they'd mutter, sinker of sleeves, wetter of leggings. Let's not forget the cobbler, an essential figure certainly, but reliant on a thin supply line that included cured leather from a local cow, waxed thread from the monastery bees, and soles cut from the gilt of quiet cows. Should any link of this delicate cord snap, people wore their shoes until they resembled inverted huts, and walking to market became a frolic through tendon strain. But perhaps the greatest culprit in the slow, sleepy sabotage of daily life was timing. With the sun as the only reliable clock, disputes over meet me after prime versus after terce led to surprisingly passionate disagreements about semantics, cheese deliveries, and church attendance. The lack of wristwatches was a kind of social lubricant, or solvent, depending on how many people forgot your birthday that decade. And yet, amid the misdelivered firewood and unspoken tension over tunic shrinkage, medieval towns hummed on. Life, stubborn and silly, persisted. Communities teetered and rebalanced, wobbly yet determined, like a tavern stool with one leg slightly shorter than the others. Which brings us now, quite gently, to an evening in late autumn. A chimney breathes out curls of smoke. A goat sings quietly to itself in the corner. And beneath the cracked thatch of a busy kitchen, something curious is happening with the peas. But that, dear dreamer, can wait until after the fire is stoked. And the story continues. If you've ever stubbed your toe on the edge of a kitchen counter and felt like civilization was crumbling beneath your feet, then congratulations. You now understand, in miniature, what medieval folks experienced daily at a much larger, more exhausting scale. Let's wander now into the heart of a medieval town. Picture damp cobblestones shinier than they have any right to be. A goat meandering across a street because fences are just aspirations, and the suspiciously sweet smell coming from someone else's refuse pile. Underneath all of that noise, there's an invisible culprit at work. Not plague this time, though that too waits with unnerving patience. No, this is the slow, never-ending war of municipal mismanagement. See, running a town in medieval Europe was rather like trying to keep a hay bale dry in a thunderstorm while also being, let's say, deeply unfamiliar with what hay is supposed to do. Local officials, called aldermen, reeves, or, if they'd eaten especially well, maybe a burgomaster, were often just merchants who'd drawn the shortest piece of straw at the annual town lottery. Suddenly, you're not just selling fish, you're in charge of the streetlights, which don't exist because it's 1342, and light is still a luxury emotion. The garbage systems, revolutionary, meaning your garbage actually revolves directly around your feet. The rule was simple: throw it out the window and let gravity and livestock figure the rest out. It's worth pausing to appreciate the spiritual resilience of the pig. The pig, trotting nobly from pile to pile, held entire sanitary systems on its porcine shoulders. Human waste collection, a delicate matter in the best of times, fell under the keen watch of the night soil man, a person whose job, with neither cape nor appreciation, was to shovel human unpleasantness from cesspits by moonlight and disappear again like a sanitation-themed Batman. And while many towns had laws about where and when people should relieve themselves, these were mostly regarded in the same way one might regard the underside of a bed. Important, perhaps, but best left unexamined. Now imagine you've made it to morning after narrowly avoiding several chamber pot missiles. Never look up in an alley. The sun is shining through a fine grey veil of wood smoke because the tanner's workshop down the street is boiling animal skins again, and no legal code in the town's 94-year-old charter says he's not allowed to. It's difficult to enforce smell laws when, let's be honest, everything smells. Urban planning was less a strategy and more a consequence of people walking places until a rut formed. Streets began where they felt like it and ended wherever someone had decided to build their house slightly diagonally for aesthetic reasons. City walls were extended based on whose cousin was doing the masonry this year. And even then, they might leave a gap for mysterious reasons detailed only in Latin footnotes no one could read. Meanwhile, fire prevention was handled by, mostly denial. Roofs were thatched, shops brimmed over with wooden trinkets and next year's kindling. Candles flickered romantically near every fabric-draped opening. You can imagine the annual excitement. And yet, people lived, laughed even. They tried to make sense of the growing world while ducking water that wasn't water and slugging through markets where you could buy a sheep's tongue, a love spell, and a tooth extraction in the same 3 minutes. They formed guilds to demand cleaner streets, because even the blacksmith's apprentices could only dodge so many surprise puddles before someone lost a boot. Even as the systems crumbled under the weight of their good intentions, towns grew anyway, stubbornly, beautifully, often sideways. But what of the town square, the central pulsing heart of any medieval community, a place of announcements, punishments, and butter sales, where love matches sparked beside stocks, holding your neighbor for allegedly stealing turnips in a dramatic but largely misunderstood heist. More than just a patch of communal dirt, it was the theater of everyday miracle, the miracle of consensus, survival, and public washing. As the twilight edges toward our next curiosity, close your eyes and imagine that market again, quieter now. A lute plays in the distance. The goats have gone to bed, and somewhere, a weary night soil man nods skyward and sighs before getting back to work. Let's take a soft step forward toward the dream world of medieval diets and the unexpected dangers of soup, of all the daily perils that gnawed at the edges of medieval life, plagues, poor dental care, and the horror of stepping in something mysterious in the street. None were quite as persistently inconvenient as the act of staying warm. Picture it. A 14th century villager named Edwig wakes up inside a timber-frame cottage, its walls lined with daub, a questionable paste of clay, straw, and whatever else the earth coughed up that week. His blanket, woven wool with all the softness of a hedgehog's handshake, and his bedmate, likely his entire extended family, plus one goat. Trust me, the goat was the warmest one of the lot. The medieval concept of central heating was, well, non-existent. Most people relied on a singular hearth in the middle of the room to provide warmth and cook food, and mildly singe the eyebrows of anyone who leaned too far in during story time. The hearth smoke curled up toward an opening in the thatched roof, sometimes leaving the house through it, and sometimes deciding to stay and socialize with your lungs. The result? Walls stained soot black, and lungs that sighed black puffs if you laughed too hard. In some houses, particularly those of well-off peasants or minor nobility, big dreams and slightly smaller bank accounts, there was a separate kitchen. A fire blazing in a separate space meant less smoke in the living room, but also more walking in the cold when retrieving the soup, which promptly cooled to glacial on the way back to the table. Speaking of walking in the cold, let's take a moment to pity the poor chambermaid who had to toss out the contents of the chamber pot in the dead of winter. There she went, clutching the sloshing porcelain under a starry sky, praying it didn't slosh too close to her slippers, and heaven forbid the wind turned on her. A medieval splash zone was not a mark of honor. To combat the chill, people layered up. Wool shirts, over-wool tunics, under-wool cloaks, accessorized by wool complaints about the weather. Underwear existed, usually linen, but often wore away faster than one could replace it. And trousers? A luxury in some cases. Otherwise, it was hosey, the medieval version of leggings, but somehow less elastic and significantly more itchy. At night, families huddled together for warmth. Imagine one large, slightly smelly, always snoring burrito of humanity, all pressed atop a straw mattress that dared to poke you with every movement. Privacy was rare. The concept of a bedtime routine? Well, if scoot next to grandma before the fire dies and don't kick the goat counts, then yes, a routine of sorts. Now, in castles and monasteries, the cold took on a more dramatic flair. Stone walls retained zero heat, acting like nature's own refrigerated display cases. In places like Yorkshire or the Alps, monks might wake up with frost upon their blankets. Monastic rules discouraged fires outside designated areas, leaving some holy souls to battle winter with only fervent prayer and frequent shivering. To make matters more delightful, bathing was less frequent in winter. Cold water had a way of encouraging spiritual cleanliness rather than physical. Ever the optimists, some folks believed bathing too often might weaken the body, or worse, excite the blood and lead to scandalous desires. This was a time when lust and pneumonia were neck and neck in terms of social concern. Interestingly, certain animals became unofficial heating devices. Cats curled on laps, chickens snuggled near ankles, and pigs, yes pigs, occasionally made highly tactile foot warmers. If you've ever wondered whether a snoring pig reciprocated affection, the answer is only if you had treats. And let us not forget the innovation of the bedfellow, an assigned sleeping companion intended to share warmth in the most platonic, yet deeply awkward of nightly partnerships. Often used in inns or while travelling, the practice meant you never quite knew who you'd wake up spooning, a squire, a merchant, or a man named Wulfstan, who dreamed with his fists. So next time you complain about your drafty apartment or the fact that your central heating only works when you squint at the thermostat just right, consider our frosty ancestors, wrapped in wool, kissed by smoke, scratching at straw mattresses, and hoping that their one good mitt wouldn't catch fire when stoking the hearth. Now, as the night deepens and frost once again paints the thatched rooftops of our gently snoring village, let's sink deeper under our modern quilts and follow the flicker of candlelight toward another surprisingly exhausting element of daily medieval life. A low fog rolled across the meadows of the medieval countryside, softening the sharp outlines of livestock and layering an already muddy world in gauze. It was the kind of morning that made a person wonder if the sun simply forgot to show up. Chickens blinked with suspicion. Peasants squelched through the mire in their best patched tunics. And all across the manors and villages of Europe, something both ridiculous and ridiculously important was about to unfold. The washing of clothes. Not a daily activity, mind you. No, that would be far too sensible. Medieval folk approached laundry with the same enthusiasm one might reserve for dental surgery during a lightning storm, accomplished rarely, reluctantly, and often with a profound sense of dread. Washing clothes in the Middle Ages was more of a seasonal event, each session treated with the ceremony of a minor religious holiday, but none of the joy. It was, quite literally, a matter of community coordination. Soap was rare and, frankly, suspicious. The most widespread detergent, wood ash mixed with stale urine. Yes, human urine. Left to ferment into a high-grade ammonia cocktail called lye. Now, you might be wondering who volunteered to collect it. The answer is, no one volunteered. Someone was simply told, usually a younger sibling or the least popular member of the household. Urine jars stood solemnly in most corners of the home, like a cousin you wish would stop coming to holiday dinners. And once enough cleaning agent had been amassed, the real work began. Clothing wasn't so much washed as it was scoured by angry elbow grease and aggressive bashing. Garments were beaten senselessly against rocks or wrung through wooden rollers with more pressure than a royal tax collector in a famine year. Water was freezing. Fingers went numb. And if you were lucky enough to own wool, congratulations. It would, post-wash, resemble a matted glandular goat in desperate need of therapy. Even medieval nobles didn't fare much better, though they often had the luxury of outsourcing their filth. Laundresses performed the thankless work in exchange for spare coin, warm broth, and occasionally a semi-functional pair of shoes. Interestingly, noble laundry wasn't necessarily cleaner, just glossier. It smelled faintly of lavender and deeply of profound regret. And heaven forbid if someone washed their clothing upstream of your water source. Medieval water disputes often began over fish and ended in soap-related brawls. In some parishes, laws were laid down to prevent washerwomen from poisoning the stream with their soapy vengeance. These local ordinances, charmingly earnest and entirely unenforceable, were mostly ignored by everyone except the town magistrate, who had to pretend to care while secretly washing his own tunic with rainwater in a rusty cauldron. Clothing itself told a story of early compromise between vanity and practicality. Bright dyes from plants and insects were applied in layers, but the colors rarely stayed put. A vibrant green tunic could fade to a sad beige with one afternoon of enthusiastic laundry. Blue, often made from woad, left sweaty peasants looking mildly Smurf-like after a long work day. And white garments, a terrible idea at the best of times, quickly adopted the tone of their environment. Mud-streaked, smoke-scented, and occasionally accessorized with straw bits from the barn, they became wearable timelines of a person's week. Of course, cleanliness was closely tied to health, or rather, people wanted it to be. But the finer points of germ theory were still centuries away. Instead, medieval thinkers believed illness came from foul smells, unbalanced humors, or perhaps one's shoes being too optimistic for the weather. Clean clothing was therefore a kind of visual aspiration, like owning 2 ducks when your neighbor had none. Monasteries, interestingly, were among the cleanest places, partially because of their access to water, but primarily because monks had time and an alarming passion for scheduling. Benedictine rule required not just regular bathing, but laundering. Imagine rows of silent men beating robes on stones while praying, a strange serenity hanging in the steam, the holy scent of sanctified socks. Laundry, as it turns out, was not just back-breaking work but a social affair. Gossip travelled on suds, scandals frothed alongside linens, and once in a while, amid the damp wool and the gentle slap of fabric against water, there emerged something rare, community joy, brief, fleeting, sock-scented. As garments were hung like forgotten flags between trees and along fence posts, the village exhaled. The task was done, until the rain came, flinging mud joyfully back onto just dried tunics, and restarting the cycle with all the menace of a gleeful toddler. Now, with shirts stiffening on the line and trousers wilting sadly into baskets, let's turn softly toward another corner of medieval daily life. A place where rest wasn't just desirable, but weaponized against social status. There was one truly universal experience across nearly all medieval communities, one that would unite lords and peasants, monks and millers, in common suffering and mild confusion. It was the inescapable horror of timekeeping. Yes, time. The thing you check on your phone 17 times a minute. The thing you set alarms by and blame for being late. In the medieval world, there were no wristwatches, no digital clocks glowing beside the bed, and certainly no snooze buttons. Time was not so much kept as it was guessed. Poorly. In theory, monks led the way. Following strict monastic schedules, they were meant to pray 8 times a day. To help with this, medieval monasteries developed water clocks, ingenious devices that dribbled droplets to measure the hours. Until they froze in winter, overflowed in spring, or got knocked over by a passing novice named Brother Walter, who was just trying to sweep. So, when in doubt, monastic timekeeping reverted to that most ancient and hopelessly unreliable assistant, Brother Eye. "Brother Eye," the abbot would say, "when's Lord's?" To which Brother Eye might squint at the barely visible sunrise and reply confidently, "Nowish." Village folk didn't fare much better. They told time by the sun, but not in any calibrated way. Sunrise was early, noon was hot, and sunset was supper, maybe. You might measure time by chores. Milking the cows meant it was morning. Letting the chickens out meant you'd overslept again and would face Mildred's passive-aggressive remarks all day. The church bell was the medieval world's closest thing to a clock. It rang out the canonical hours, matins, prime, terce, sext, and others, all sounding rather like a Roman law firm. But here's the fun part. Those bells were tweaked by the local priest or bell ringer, who often had wildly individual interpretations of God's schedule. So your breakfast in one village might be another's pre-dawn vigil. Travellers were often stunned by how time warped from one town to the next, depending on how caffeinated the bell ringer was. And then came the real chaos. Daylight saving time. Sort of. You see, medieval hours weren't standardized like modern ones. They were seasonal, which means that an hour in summer lasted longer than an hour in winter. Yes, you heard that correctly. Medieval folk split daylight into 12 portions no matter the season. So in July, 1 hour could feel like 70 minutes, while in December, the astonished hour whizzed past in what felt like 38. Time was elastic, whimsical, and occasionally rude. Try organizing a meeting under these conditions. "Come at the 3rd hour after sunrise," you'd say. "Which sunrise?" they'd ask. "Today's, obviously," you'd huff. But what if it was cloudy? Did it count as sunrise if no one saw it? Local councils learned to pad their appointments with generous allowances. Royal proclamations simply declared vague intentions. "The king shall address the people around mid-morn." That might mean 9 o'clock, or 11, possibly after lunch. Merchants, ever the overachievers of medieval society, tried to impose a bit of order. They developed portable sundials, also known as pocket confusion. These ingenious gadgets had to be tilted just right, aligned with the correct latitude, and used only when the sun was awake, which, in England, could be never. Still, there were few clocks. The first mechanical public clocks didn't tick their smug way into European towns until the late 13th century, and even then, they tended to strike the hour once, or twice, or arbitrarily, because the mechanism often jammed or skipped when no one was looking. So daily life in a medieval town pulsed not with punctuality, but with a gentle sense of approximation. There were no frantic countdowns, no calendar alerts, only the slow toll of the bell, the shifting light on a cottage wall, and the way your shadow stretched across the hedgerow. You knew it was time to stop if your stomach growled louder than your neighbour's pigs. And didn't that create its own rhythm, in a way? As bizarre and maddening as it seems now, the medieval muddle of time gave life a sort of elastic charm. Everything was late, and somehow, exactly when it needed to be. And speaking of charm, let's take a quiet walk to another essential hero of the village. A place where chaos, commerce, and cabbage collide upon weekly repeat. Yes, the medieval market awaits. In the dim amber of a medieval morning, as hearths yawned open with soft embers and the wet scent of dung-smeared streets began its daily rise, there awoke a singular challenge that spared no soul. the curious case of accounting, medieval style. Now, don't imagine ink-stained spectacles and clever banking halls. No, medieval bookkeeping was far more of an interpretive dance than an exact science. You see, numbers were still suspicious foreigners in many corners of Europe, and most villagers believed them to be tools of the devil, or worse, the tax collector. Coinage, when it showed up at all, was eclectic, irregular, and occasionally made of suspicious metals found too near pig pens. A silver penny in one town might weigh half what it did in the next, and copper coins bore the awkward faces of monarchs no one dared mention aloud, mainly because no one knew who they were. Some coins still bore the Roman eagle. Others were etched with symbols so mysterious they were probably just medieval doodles. In such a world, how was one to keep track of who owed whom what? Well, the answer, like most things in the Middle Ages, involved sticks, not metaphors, actual sticks. The tally stick, an elegant solution, if you were part beaver. Here was the process. Debts were recorded by carving notches into a piece of wood, sometimes hazel, sometimes willow, depending on the availability of trees and witchcraft. Once the tally stick was sufficiently notched, it was split lengthwise. One piece for the debtor, one piece for the creditor. The notches would match up precisely, which meant it was nearly impossible to forge or dispute. Inconvenient if you were a creative debtor, but comfortingly fair, unless the stick got wet, or was burned, or eaten, as apparently happened once with a bishop's particularly minty stick. And if sticks weren't your preferred medium of economic expression, there was always barter. The age-old system of I give you 3 eggs, you give me that shoe. It was a flexible system, though it could go sideways fast. One farmer was rumoured to have nearly traded away his wife in exchange for 6 sheep and a very persuasive goose. Fortunately, the goose changed her mind. Clerks, for their part, tried valiantly to drag order from the quagmire. They used parchment to record tallies, turning entire abbey treasuries into damp piles of barely legible Latin gibberish. Most of these monks had handwriting that resembled exhausted spaghetti, so deciphering accounts became less a matter of math and more of monastic intuition. Add to this the problem of time itself. The medieval calendar was a haystack of inconsistency. A month might begin on the appearance of the new moon, or when the local priest squinted at the sky and declared it was definitely March by now. There were feast days, saint days, and market days, each jostling to define the week, while villagers just hoped they could get to Thursday without a divine surprise. Even worse, summer might extend for weeks or vanish overnight, depending entirely on whether the weather decided to rain potatoes. None of this helped when trying to schedule debt repayments, particularly when your tally stick claimed the cow you owed a neighbour was already paid for 5 moons ago, which might have been last week, or not. The Crown, noble in its optimism and regularly broke, tried to introduce uniform measurements and coinage. 1 shilling for all, they cried. But peasants, whose daily life involved measuring fields with their feet and grains of wheat, were unimpressed by such uniformity. One old farmer from East Anglia was heard muttering, "A shilling's fine, love, but can I plant it?" Despite it all, trade, barter, and rudimentary math chugged along like a cart with 1 square wheel. Communities functioned, somehow. Some chickens were overvalued, some debts never paid, some tally sticks mismatched and burned, causing small fiscal mysteries lost to time. But maybe that's the quiet magic of it all, that through fogs of confusion and systems made of wood and whimsy, medieval folk still managed to live, eat, marry, argue, and laugh. perhaps with only slightly more financial clarity than some of us today. And so, as night spills again across the thatched roofs and miscounted debts of a snoring village, we drift toward another corner of medieval life, where cleanliness was next to, well, something other than godliness. In the quiet hush before dawn, when chickens shifted drowsily on their perches and the village dog snored with all 4 feet twitching, there was one figure already awake and muttering, the medieval housewife. Or, to be more accurate, the good wife. Though to be fair, her daily schedule would make modern CEOs look like amateurs on a wellness retreat. For within the timbered walls of her slightly crooked wattle and daub abode, our heroine's day began not with birdsong, but with the urgent realization that the fire, her only source of heat and cooking, must not have gone out overnight. If it had, the hunt for hot embers from a neighbor would commence. Nothing spells neighborly bonding like borrowing fire while still in your night-shifted linen shift. As villages stirred, the rhythm of daily chores thudded into life, a ceaseless ballet of fetching, heating, grinding, kneading, feeding, milking, spinning, scolding, rinsing, and somewhere between all that, possibly breathing. Medieval homes were little factories of survival, run almost entirely by women who also had to dodge the occasional rogue goat barreling through the door. Bread baking was an especially drama-filled affair. Remember, flour didn't come in pre-milled convenience sacks. It came with weevils and the delightful task of hand-sifting. Then came the grinding, using a quernstone, which was essentially a medieval treadmill minus the cardio benefits. The upper stone was rotated over the lower one by hand, an exercise that built biceps the monastic scribes could only dream of. And all this for coarse, dark bread that could double as a self-defense tool. Speaking of bread, the village oven, if one existed, was the social media hub of the 14th century. Rural communities often shared a communal bake oven. If you arrived late, you'd have to wait, in a short queue that doubled as a gossip salon. Who'd stolen whose hens? Who'd failed to tithe appropriately? And most importantly, just how strong was Agnes's mead last Sunday? Beyond the baking and boiling, women also dabbled in baseline pharmaceuticals, herbs, poultices, and the occasional superstition-sprinkled healing ceremony. These cunning women often knew enough to cure a leg sprain or soothe a colicky baby with warmed fennel, water. They were respected, unless they healed too well, in which case they were suddenly accused of bewitching the healing back into place. Meanwhile, the men, lest they be thought absent, were likely swinging sharp objects at things. Fieldwork, blacksmithing, repairing roofs, rethatching leaking walls, cobbling shoes that somehow always split in the middle of a storm. It was physical labor made emotionally more bearable by cursing in Low German. Children would help as soon as they stopped drooling, which, in historical records, was optimistically claimed to be somewhere around age 5. Young boys chased pigs, worked in the fields, or were apprenticed out to tradesmen who didn't believe in lunch breaks. Girls helped spin wool, scare crows, and do roughly 1,000 things less glamorous than they sound. Childhood, while technically existent, more closely resembled an unpaid internship in a disaster relief operation. Then came midday, the medieval dinner served sometime between morning labor and the creeping realization that you'd have to start supper soon. A typical peasant meal might include something lovingly referred to as pottage, a thick stew made of grains, bits of vegetables, and whatever meat was either left over or deemed marginally not dangerous. Sanitation. Let's delicately say it was. It tried. Waste disposal was mostly a matter of toss it in the ditch and hope for rain. In summer, this became a national emergency. Laundry, too, required entire days of soaking, beating, rinsing, and drying off tunics that had absorbed everything from soot to sheep-related incidents. Evenings held a strange kind of peace. The animals had been fed, the children somewhat rinsed, and any surviving ale was now gently sloshing in ceramic mugs. The hearth glowed, and oiled parchment windows flickered with the amber light of burning peat. Stories were told, wool was spun, and tasks were quietly repeated by firelight, almost meditatively. It's easy to romanticize medieval village life until you remember the fleas. But within that daily grind was a curious resilience, a quiet rhythm that beat on like a drum made of bread crust and determination. It may have been exhausting, but there was comfort in routine, warmth in shared labor, and always a chicken trying to roost somewhere inappropriate. And just as the sun dipped below the farmlands and the fire was coaxed gently into its overnight slumber, the village too fell into rest. Somewhere in that sleepy stillness, the world paused, just long enough for us to take one step further into the candlelit contours of daily life, where other challenges, less obvious and often far itchier, await the unsuspecting medieval villager. If one were to ask a medieval townsman what the most dangerous job in the village was, the answer was surprisingly not knight charging at dragons, or court jester with a sarcastic streak. More often than not, they'd nod solemnly and mutter, "Tanner." Yes, tanners, the unsung stinksmiths of the medieval economy. Their job was to turn floppy, recently former animals into stiff, re-wearable fashion statements. But the process, oh dear dreamer, the process was less fairy tale and more flatulence. To begin, the hides had to be soaked in vats, not brimming with rosewater and lavender, but fermenting with urine. Human urine, donated generously by villagers, sometimes even paid for by the tanner, to encourage, shall we say, liquid participation. The ammonia in the urine was the active agent that loosened hair and flesh from the hides. It also had the delightful effect of turning entire neighborhoods into nasal war zones. A strong gust of wind could reduce grown men to tears and inspire mass migration of anyone possessing a functioning nose. But necessity breeds courage, and leather was essential. It clothed feet, armored wrists, and when stiffened just right, made chairs only, slightly less painful than sitting on a sack of porcupines. So the tanner, sworn enemy of good sense and social invitations, endured, often relegated to the edge of town, where the air had already given up. Living next to a tannery was not ideal, but in truth, very few medieval homes were built with any concept of ideal. Most villagers resided in timber-framed houses padded with wattle and daub, a construction method that essentially said, let's mix mud, straw, and occasional chicken feathers, and then live inside it. Walls were thin. Privacy was a rumor. Room for a bed, an unexpected luxury. Most people shared the same sleeping space, often the entire family, plus any livestock small enough to sneak in. And before you judge medieval co-sleeping customs, remember this also meant you had a built-in alarm system. A goat bleating at 3 a.m. was far more effective than the modern snooze button. Now, contrary to many Renaissance fair assumptions, medieval villagers were not perpetually drenched in dirt. They did bathe, just not exactly by your modern spa standards. A public bathhouse was often part of village life until the 14th century plague paranoia made people worry that hot water opened the pores and let disease in. What a tragic romance. the end of joyful communal stewing due to bacteriological misunderstandings. When people did wash at home, they did so with caution and cleverness. Water was a precious resource, especially clean water. Buckets had to be hauled from rivers or wells, usually by the youngest family member who'd been slow to rise that morning. Soap, when available, was sometimes made of animal fat and ash, an exfoliating experience you didn't forget easily. And yet, as we drift through these earthy images of worn wood, sour vats, and quarter-frozen chamber pots, it's worth remembering that the medieval day was not all grim necessity. Evenings were often alive with stories. Without TikTok or the tragic allure of online, shopping storytelling was not a hobby, but a pillar of communal entertainment. Villagers would orbit around alehouse fires, swapping tales about enchanted forests, misbehaving saints, or that one time old Bernard tried to wrestle a pig and lost both dignity and trousers. Yes, pigs again. For a creature so squat and unglamorous, pigs had deep cultural significance. They were walking larders, garbage disposals, and occasionally totally unwelcome intruders on church steps. Their grunts were as common as church bells, and their leisurely strolls through town reminded everyone just who was truly in charge of sanitation. But perhaps the greatest daily challenge of medieval life came not from tanners or pigs or soap made from questionable chemistry, but from time itself. With the sun as their clock and bells as their calendar, peasants lived in a rhythm that was at once natural and notoriously unreliable. Affairs were often rescheduled simply because clouds obscured the sundial or because Father Thomas totally miscounted Lent again. Still, amidst this lovable chaos, one thing became clear. The survival of a medieval village relied less on iron or coin, and more on something far older and smellier: cooperation. A shared fire, a shared bucket, a barefoot kid yelling, "Sheep in the bakery again." And as the fire crackles low and the stars wink over a thatched roof or three, we follow a sliver of moonlight, not to a castle or a battlefield, but toward an altogether humbler mystery: the fate of medieval bread, and the bakers bold enough to brave public scrutiny armed only with yeast. As twilight settled over the thatched rooftops and lichen-kissed stones of a forgotten medieval village, a subtle but persistent menace prowled the muddy lanes and half-collapsed guild halls. Not a dragon, nor a plague. No, tonight's tale centers around something far more vexing, lurking softly in plain sight: calculations, specifically the medieval obsession with measuring things they didn't quite understand. You see, numbers in the Middle Ages had a complicated relationship with everyday life. People could count, yes. They could tally sacks of barley, sheep legs, and indulgences purchased from slightly suspicious friars. But the act of measuring, weighing, and accounting, well, that was enough to make even the boldest knight reconsider his lance career and open a tavern instead. In an era without calculators or coffee breaks, something as trivial as splitting up a village's common lands could become a generational feud. Every field had to be divided according to ancient allotments, which had been drawn up by someone's slightly senile grandfather, who insisted on measuring everything by how many footsteps it took, while drunk on mead. This, naturally, led to the great medieval tradition of angry field arguments, where disputes about half an ox length of soil might end in an actual ox being hurled at a neighbour's cart. Of course, medieval life was also unusually fond of units of measurement that made no earthly sense. The width of a barleycorn, the length of a man's arm, but only if the man used to be a blacksmith, and only on Thursdays. There was the hide a measurement of land which theoretically was enough to support one family and their livestock, assuming the livestock were well behaved and no one ate potatoes, which hadn't been invented yet. Then came the tithes. 1/10 of everything you owned was to be given to the church. That included hay, pigs, chickens, and presumably any extra children you weren't particularly fond of. The village priest became a surprising authority on all things cow-shaped, often seen squinting at butter rounds and declaring, "That is only 9.5/10 good wife Mildred," while helping himself to an extra wheel, just in case. But this tangled web of maths truly collapsed upon itself in the glorious and confusing act of inventorying. The census, when royal stewards rode in on damp horses with ink-drenched parchment to question villagers about their turnip count. "And how many hearths doth thy home possess?" they'd ask a wide-eyed peasants who had, until that moment, never thought of fire as something that could be possessed in units. Inventorying caused sincere panic. Suddenly, people had to recall not only how many shoes they owned, but how many shoeless cousins were currently borrowing them. You never wanted to declare too much, lest you attract taxes, or too little, lest you appear poor and be assigned more taxes. It was a perilous balancing act best left to someone with a large cloak, fast horse, and false name. Even trade was an exhausting arithmetic expedition. Imagine bartering a bundle of turnips for 2 hens, a pair of boots, and a promise that Gerald the Cooper wouldn't sing under your window anymore. It required not just negotiating skills, but the ability to divide by 3 while avoiding eye contact with a potentially cursed goose. And let's not forget the miracle of medieval bookkeeping. Monastic scribes, hunched like sleepy owls over their parchment, recorded quantities meticulously but in Latin, which the villagers couldn't read and the monks barely understood. Miscommunications were inevitable. One confused line in the ledger, and suddenly Brother Oswald owed 12 pigs to the king's taxman and 1 unicorn to the village alewife, neither of which he could produce. It's marvellous, really, how a lack of consistent maths could nearly undo entire communities. But also reassuring, because at the end of a day filled with miscounted oat barrels and misinterpreted levies, folk still gathered around a hearth, the unofficial unit of warmth, and laughed at who'd managed the worst tally that week. Usually Reginald, who once submitted a tax declaration written in verse. Beautiful rhyme, zero math, legendary audit. Now, as the candlelight flickers low on another mismeasured sack of grain, let us quietly wander toward a place even messier than land disputes and wool taxes. The medieval kitchen, where chaos, creativity, and a truly confusing use of cinnamon await. The medieval tailor, a figure little celebrated, rarely feared, and yet wholly essential. Life in the Middle Ages may have been full of crusades, cathedrals, and the occasional spirited trial by fire, but there was also the very practical question of trousers. Who made them? Who decided how tight was too tight? And what happened when tailors got ambitious? You might assume medieval tailors lived tidy lives with spools, needles, and a stern respect for symmetry. But step into a cramped timber-framed workshop in, say, 1382 Norwich, and you'd find chaos stitched together with ambition, gossip, and a faint whiff of tallow candles and damp wool. Firstly, fabric was scandalously expensive. A single bolt of good English wool could cost enough to make even a merchant mutter a quiet expletive in Latin. Because of this, every inch mattered. Tailors developed a sixth sense for maximizing cloth, sometimes to the detriment of comfort. The result? Sleeves that pinched, hose that sagged, and codpieces that couldn't quite decide if they were modesty or menace. Still, clothes mattered, especially, when survival was a daily chore. Your outfit said everything about who you were, or at least who you desperately wanted others to think you were. Instead of LinkedIn bios, people had hat height. If your tunic hem hovered above the knee, you were probably trying to make a statement, or perhaps just ran out of cloth tokens. In cities, tailors were tightly regulated by guilds. These weren't simply clubs where members swapped needle tips and embroidered grievances onto doilies. Oh no. Guilds wrote books detailing proper seam depths and acceptable shoulder droop. Violating these codes could mean fines, public shame, and, if you were especially rebellious, the horror of having to undo your stitches with a bone needle in poor light. But here's where it gets deliciously medieval. Clothes began to test the boundaries not just of fabric, but of morality. As fashion sped up, which in medieval time was something like noticing one new idea every 15 years, outrage followed closely behind. Enter the sumptuary laws. These were royal edicts dictating what people could wear, typically based on their social class. Were you a humble fishmonger, but felt your inner self was really more of a burgundy velvet doublet kind of guy? Tough luck. Sumptuary law said no, and if you dared to defy it, you could be fined, or worse, assigned mandatory beige. Any tailor worth their snips knew how to dance around these laws with sartorial sleight of hand. Extra folds here, a hidden lining there. Was that brocade for a merchant's wife, cleverly stitched to resemble cheaper linen on the outside? Possibly. Did noblemen sometimes bribe tailors to secretly add gold thread embroidery beneath their cloaks so it wouldn't show unless they twirled? Absolutely. But tailors, once emboldened, sometimes went too far. One infamous case in 15th century Florence involved a tailor who invented what was essentially the first padded shoulder. It threw the city into weeks of debate and entirely disrupted the silhouette norms of the time. There are letters complaining of young men walking around like armored hens. Riots? No. But letters indeed. The church was also deeply invested, because everything from shoe points to collar width was viewed as a reflection of the soul, or lack thereof. Pointed shoes, for example, were declared Satan adjacent for leading the wearer off the straight path, both literally and metaphorically. Tailors accused of enabling moral collapse with excessive tapestries of finery were sometimes brought before moral courts and asked probing questions like, why is this tunic bulging in places where piety ought to reside? Despite condemnation from pulpits and proclamations from kings, fashion thrived. Tailors, those charming middlemen of modesty and rebellion, continued their plucky work, wielding needles with the precision of a surgeon and the discretion of a tavern bard on market day. And still, every village had one. A quiet, hunched figure bent beside a candle, adjusting a hem, whispering to a sullen apprentice, "No, Thomas, the left leg is not the same as the right, but opposites. They're identical. That's the point." Even in the court of the king, tailors had power. A wrongly hemmed royal robe could derail a coronation. Imagine the gasps if velvet bunched at the ankle, or worse, if the shoulders sat too far apart, rendering His Majesty a waddling mantis. Such stakes were daily life for our needle-wielding artisans, quiet creators of comfort and chaos, unseen until everything went wrong. So next time you pull a thread from your sleeve, think of Gerald, the 14th century York tailor who got excommunicated for attaching sleeves with imported silk 1 inch too ornate. Now, let's wander away from the workbench and peek into something just as peculiar. how medieval food preservation practices occasionally backfired. In one particularly damp corner of medieval life, nestled between the grand tales of knights and plagues, we find the humble, yet bewilderingly complex, daily ritual of water, or rather, the conspicuous lack of it. Picture it: a thatched roof village where water didn't exactly gush from faucets, but more or less trickled from questionable sources. Wells, streams, and rain barrels were the primary supply lines, though the rain barrel was often more of a romantic notion than practical reality. Collecting rain meant positioning wooden buckets outside and hoping the chickens didn't knock them over during a squabble. As for streams, well, they were community spaces in every possible way. People drank from them, washed in them, emptied chamber pots near them, and very quickly learned that downstream was not where you wanted to be in the town hierarchy. Now, let's talk about bathing, or more fittingly, about not bathing. Contrary to what you might have heard at a particularly spirited Renaissance fair, medieval people did bathe, sometimes, sort of. They even had public bathhouses in many towns, granted, places where local gossip flowed far more freely than soap. But a bath was largely a luxury for the cold and the wealthy, and sometimes the suspicious. There were actual court cases linking frequent bathers to suspicious behavior, because clearly, anyone regularly smelling pleasant must be up to something deeply unwholesome. The real challenge, however, was that clean water often refused to cooperate. Wells could go dry, streams could be muddied, and most towns hadn't quite figured out the subtle yet important division between fresh water and the contents of the latrine. Town planners of the time seemed to believe geography would sort itself out, so long as you didn't fall in. One particularly tragicomic example comes from 14th century London, where sanitation was so mismanaged that the city banned animal slaughter from within its walls. Naturally, everyone just began butchering animals just outside the walls instead, and promptly dumped the remains into the city ditches, somewhat missing the point. And then we must, alas, address the cesspits. Oh yes, while the nobles had elaborate garderobes, tower toilets that emptied into moats, with the hopeful assumption that running water would wash their worries away, the average household had pits, dug with optimism, ignored with reckless abandon. These cozy backyard mementos of digestion were meant to be emptied regularly, a task typically assigned to gong farmers. Now, the gong farmer had a job that was, quite literally, the bottom of the barrel. They would sneak in during the night to shovel out humanity's efforts, one wooden bucket at a time. Respected? Not particularly. Paid well? Surprisingly, yes. You could make decent coin scooping what no one else dared. A reminder, perhaps, that capitalism finds a way. This chore, while heroic in its own pungent way, didn't always go smoothly. There are records of cesspits collapsing, and not metaphorically. In 1183, a nobleman in Erfurt and dozens of his guests fell into a latrine when the wooden floor beneath the feasting hall gave way. The event would go down, apologies, in unfortunate memory as one of history's less savoury dinner parties. Water woes extended into agriculture too. Without modern irrigation, farming relied on the sky's rather unpredictable generosity. If it rained too little, crops withered. If it rained too much, they rotted. And if it rained just enough, mud, endless mud, the kind that eats your shoes and harbours a suspicious smell. So how did people manage? With grit and goats and a healthy dose of resignation. They trudged through, raising their children to tread carefully around puddles of unknown origin, teaching them to drink ale. not because it was fun, but because fermented barley was safer than stream water. Al, the medieval drink of champions, toddlers, monks, and grandmothers alike. All slightly buzzed, all mildly hydrated. Still, there is a quiet romance in this grubby struggle, the resilience of a people who, against all olfactory odds, built communities, raised families, and even invented soap, though often neglected to use it. And as the moon rose over the thatched rooftops, and another day of very selective washing came to an end, someone in the village likely stared into their muddy basin and thought, perhaps tomorrow we boil the water before the cat sits in it. But of course, the medieval world had more pressing dilemmas, like preventing their homes from accidentally becoming chimneys, which, as we'll soon discover, was not as rare as one might hope. Somewhere just past the clang of blacksmiths' anvils and the distant chant of monks quoting Latin no one truly understood, there thrived a curious mix of superstition, survival instinct, and general medieval confusion that shaped one of the most important relationships of the age, the one between medieval folk and their toilets. Ah yes, today we visit the latrines. Sleepy history often skips over the necessary side of human existence. But let's glide politely into the world of medieval sanitation, where entire towns balanced dangerously on the precipice of a bucket. To begin, it's fair to say that the concept of personal hygiene had not yet been fully embraced. Bathing occurred on a schedule best described as ambitiously rare, and toilet habits, well, they lived in that quiet corner of history where imagination often works better than reality. Yet the truth is deeply human and oddly fascinating. In large castles and monasteries, where residents had the luxury of stone interiors and scrolls of rules, there existed structures known as garderobes. These weren't closets, despite sounding like the perfect place to store doublets and puffy sleeves. In fact, the word comes from the medieval belief that odors could deter moths. So, yes, people hung clothes above the loo to keep pests away. The implication here, and brace yourself, is that the smell was considered functional. Medieval logic was unbothered. These garderobes were vertical shafts built into the castle walls, often leading to a pit, or, in the more stylish of installations, the exterior moat. Yes, the very same moat that gleamed in the morning mist, allegedly defending the kingdom, was politely seasoned with whatever the Lord ate last Tuesday. Moti McToilety. For patrons of the village, the options were ever more creative. Townsfolk without permanent facilities became masters of the chamber pot, the beloved and beleaguered vessel stored discreetly under beds, chairs, or, regrettably, used in the middle of the night with very little ceremony. Once full, the contents were usually hurled into the street with a cry of "Gardez l'eau," French for "watch out for the water." Except it wasn't just water, and nobody ever really watched out. This charming routine led to roads slick as banana peels in January, and outbreaks of illness that could merrily decimate a population by lunchtime. The humble rat thrived in this setting, practically writing sonnets of gratitude for all the organic landfill they waded through. It was not until much later that people realized the correlation between sanitation and survival. But in the Middle Ages, the consensus leaned toward divine punishment and an untrustworthy wind. There were public latrines in some towns tucked into dark alleyways and managed with varying degrees of interest. These benches with opening holes accommodated multiple backsides at once, like a sort of grim social club. Talk of the weather, politics, and the baker's alarmingly pale complexion flowed freely. No partitions, just a long plank, a heavy cloak, and the quiet hope that no one made eye contact. In monasteries, however, sanitation was taken slightly more seriously, partly because monks needed all the help they could get to stay alive through centuries of boiled turnips and incense-triggered lung irritation. Monastic latrines, known as reredauters, were usually long stone slabs with seats placed above rushing water. Ingenious, really, except when the rivers dried up or rose too high. Middle ground plumbing was never their strong suit. Now, where did all this waste go when not accidentally hitting shoes? Rivers, moats, pits, but also streets and ditches and the occasional unfortunate neighbour's doorstep. It wasn't just unsavoury, it was dangerous. Dysentery could waltz through a town with terrifying grace, and death by toilet proximity was not unheard of. In fact, there are reports of castle latrines collapsing under too much weight or improper maintenance, sending unsuspecting noblemen plummeting into eternity with a rather undignified splash. Still, the medieval world carried on, trousers slightly damp and noses heroically unflinching. Over time, bits of wisdom emerged, like not building your home downhill from the tannery's ditch, or identifying the town drunk based on where, precisely, he relieved himself during festivals. Even in matters as unglamorous as digestion, humanity pressed forward, inventing little luxuries, sharing quiet wisdom, and waving politely from opposite ends of shared planks. Because when society's literally full of it, humour becomes the only clean option left. And now, as moonlight stretches across the thatched rooftops and the streets fall blissfully quiet, save for the occasional echoing garde-lo, we tiptoe gently onward into a dreamier hall of domestic history, one that smells quite a bit nicer. In the gentle dim of a candle-lit room, smoke curling skyward like a slow yawn from the ceiling beams, we turn our minds, dreamy and drowsy, to one of the darkest pillars of medieval life, hygiene, or rather, the radiant absence of it. Now, medieval towns didn't smell bad because people disliked cleanliness. No, they simply lived by a different olfactory code. In a world without deodorant, germ theory, or scented hand soaps that promised a whiff of lavender and a life free from plague, noses simply adapted. What we might wrinkle our modern nostrils at: rotting fish, chamber pots dumped in alleys, sheep entrails drying on a hook. In medieval towns, these scents were less offensive and more of a daily vibe. Bathing, for instance, was viewed with a curious sort of ambivalence. True, the Romans had left behind their glorious bathhouses with mosaics and warm conversation, but over the centuries, the idea of public baths began to feel increasingly suspect. Warm water, standing still. Surely the devil had something to do with that. Some even believed that opening your pores in a hot bath invited illness in, like a rude neighbour barging through an unlocked door. Still, bathhouses didn't vanish completely. In fact, for a while, they were delightfully multi-purpose. You could wash off the week's grime, chat with neighbours, and, in some establishments, reserve time with a companion who came with their own price tag and a cheerful wink. The line between bathhouse and brothel was a thin one, often blurred by the steam. Eventually, cities began shutting them down under virtuous pretenses, but also, perhaps coincidentally, after outbreaks of plague. No one wanted to be the one who paid for a bath and came home with buboes. Of course, not everyone completely abandoned washing. Some folks created a sort of hygiene by hierarchy. Royals, for example, might not bathe often, but they did have linen shirts that were changed with impressive frequency. The belief was that by rubbing against the skin, clean linen wicked away, filth, essentially laundering your body via shirt. A sort of medieval dry shampoo, but with sleeves. Hair care, too, was part ritual, part battlefield. Combs made of bone or wood were dragged valiantly through unwashed locks, each strand a testament to patience. Lice were a given. There were even little tools called knit combs, devoted entirely to evicting those tenacious tenants. If you were of noble birth, you might douse your head in a mixture of vinegar and rosemary water. If you were not, you might simply scratch and carry on. Toilets, meanwhile, were largely aspirational. Some castles had garderobes, holes in stone chutes that dropped waste down into open moats. This, incidentally, made alligators quite thankful they stuck to the tropics. In towns, waste collection was even more democratic. Chamber pots were emptied into the streets, often with the shout of "Garde-loup," a warning to the unsuspecting below. It's said to be the root of the phrase loo for toilet, which is a fun linguistic evolution rooted entirely in human waste and ducking reflexes. Some cities, bless them, tried to impose rules. Paris banned dumping in the streets. It didn't go well. Enforcement was spotty, citizens stubborn. One might argue that this age-old conflict between personal freedom and public cleanliness was a sort of prequel to modern urban recycling efforts, but with more airborne excrement. Still, amidst all the questionable aromas and pestilence potential, there were moments of scented grace. Apothecaries sold perfumes, though these were more for masking than cleansing. And in gardens tucked behind monasteries or stately homes, lavender, chamomile, and rosemary were grown not just for potion making, but to press gently between linens or sip in modest attempts at dignity. It was not that medieval people didn't want to be clean. It's just that their version of clean was, let's call it, imaginatively interpreted. And in their imaginations, perhaps, they were already shining with purity, draped in homespun virtue and the faintest whiff of onion stew. And after all, in a world where spiritual cleanliness was deemed more important than the literal kind, who needed soap if one had confession? As flickering candles shrink to dull orange stubs, and the last waft of medieval rosemary water drifts by, we'll drift gently into the next layer of daily mystery, a whisper of bread, beer, and the curious power of grain. As the last bell of twilight chimed across the mossy rooftops of the medieval village, its sound was not unlike the exhale of a tired world, which, given the daily ordeals of its inhabitants, was entirely appropriate. For all their sword-swinging and cathedral building, one of the most formidable challenges medieval folk faced was, in fact, the medieval folk themselves. Not out of cruelty, well, not always, but simply due to the complex headache-shaped tapestry that was social life in the Middle Ages. Let us drift, now gentle listener, into the crowded alleys of social obligations, guild feuds, marriage markets, and churchy nosiness. For nothing says good night quite like passive-aggressive tithing and a 14th century bake sale gone wrong. First, picture yourself as a humble cooper, a barrel maker. You rise each dawnish to hammer staves into submission with a rhythm that could lull even a very anxious goat. But then, a problem. The baker down the lane, Thomas, insists you've overcharged him for the wine cask you made last spring. To retaliate, he reports you to the guild. Not just any guild, mind you, but your own. A fraternal brotherhood allegedly devoted to fairness, fellowship, and a shared tolerance for beer. You appear before them, heart-pounding, and explain the price was fair on account of the war, the wood shortage, and Thomas's inconvenient fondness for putting wax on his moustache before bargaining. Justice, such as it was, depends heavily on whether the guild master likes your pies, which he almost certainly does not, after the cumin incident of Candlemas. Guilds were medieval life's attempt at human resources, except with more ceremonial robes and significantly less enthusiasm for change. They controlled prices, quality, and who was allowed into the sacredness of, say, boot mending. They also enforced rules like no working on feast days, which were frequent and occasionally invented on the spot just to get out of finishing a tunic. But your woes don't end there. Oh no, because across the green, your Auntie Alfreda has heard a very worrying thing at church. Apparently, young people are dancing together. Feet are touching the ground in coordinated, rhythmic defiance of moral gravity. This is alarming. She has immediately written to the bishop, who, by virtue of being human and alive in the Middle Ages, is both a spiritual leader and the only man in the region who knows Latin. He is furious and has promised to issue a strongly worded parchment threatening all frivolous feet with excommunication. In small communities where everyone's lives intertwine more tightly than a hedgerow in spring, gossip could carry more weight than the Lord Mayor's hat. Rumours could bind marriages, end careers, or start feuds that lasted generations over who truly owns the pig that wandered into Madge's garden during the harvest fair of 47. Even celebrations required careful politics. A wedding, ostensibly a joyous joining of two families and their various sheep, quickly turned tragic if your cousin insisted on serving fish inside a pudding. The guests whispered. One man fainted. The priest made the sign of the cross over the blancmange. And just like that, your family's culinary line was shunned by all the respectable onion farmers for 3 consecutive decades. And then there was the ever-watchful eye of the manor court. You see, feudal lords knew that serfs might get ideas. Ideas like borrowing a neighbour's plough without exactly asking, or collecting firewood from the wrong hedge. These weighty crimes were tried with all the pageantry of a midsummer pig chase. A jury of your peers, mostly other sweaty farmers, would solemnly convene, and someone would tap a stick importantly in the mud, while Lady Marjorie testified you had rolled your eyes during Whitsun. Social life in medieval villages was rich, tangled, and frequently exhausting, like living inside a tapestry that was being restitched while you were still wearing it. And yet, it pulsed with community, the kind made not from luxury or ease, but from mutual resilience, shared songs, and the comforting predictability of your neighbour stealing your apples every Michaelmas. So as the night deepens, and the candle wax begins to yawn down the sides of its brass holder, let us float gently past the pews and pillories, drift beyond guild feuds and poorly tuned lutes, and rest in the soft hush that blankets all things in time. For in our next quiet breath, we shall wander into something somehow even more dramatic. The mud-spattered finale of medieval life's biggest mistake. As the sun sets for the final time over our medieval village, the thatched rooftops glowing honey gold in the hush of a twilight, no longer punctuated by clanging buckets or livestock-related tragedies, we find the peasants, still trying to get some rest. But thankfully, this time, the goats are not involved. You see, despite all the daily absurdities medieval life hurled their way, church bells ringing with suspicious enthusiasm, turnip shortages sparking mild existential crises, and the occasional disagreement about who owned which piece of mud, people endured. Not necessarily with grace, but certainly with a kind of resilient, lumpy charm. A charm clothed in scratchy wool, slightly damp, and smelling faintly of pickled fish. And yet, Our tale ends not with catastrophe, but quiet, because as history has shown time and again, it's not fire or war that lays siege to the soul, it's chores. Endless, muddy chores. Take Marjorie, for example. By the time she turned 40, ancient, really, by the local standards, she had churned enough butter to qualify as a one-woman dairy empire. She could recite the Lord's Prayer in Latin, but only backwards and only when barefoot. She may not have owned a cow, but through relentless borrowing and returning rituals, she achieved something far rarer. Respectable social standing. That, and an astonishing number of borrowed chickens. Then there was young Osric, the village's only literate blacksmith, and, unofficially, the inventor of the sarcastic prayer. His favourite began, "Lord, deliver me from splinters, soup without salt, and sermons longer than sowing season." Naturally, the local priest was not amused, but he couldn't say much while riding Osric's exceptionally well-shod mule. And let us not forget Edith, who single-handedly kept 3 families alive during the famine by mastering the inherently mystical art of stew stretching. To this day, well, probably not to this day, since she's been gone for roughly 800 years, but in her day, Edith was rumoured to make soup from just an onion, 2 hopeful thoughts, and a pebble that had briefly brushed against a carrot. Despite these minor miracles, life in the village never got easier. It just became more familiar. And it was that familiarity, that solemn predictability of patching roofs and swatting flies with a rolled-up psalter, that wove people together. Even the bailiff, who insisted his cart was haunted by the ghost of a slightly miffed ox, found comfort in routine. Haunted or not, it was still the only cart in the village with 3 working wheels. As night deepens and stars scatter across the heavens, remember that the medieval world was quiet, not because it lacked noise. Heaven knows pigs snore louder than saints, but because people had learned to find silence between chores, peace between plagues, laughter between loaves of coarse, questionably textured bread. Even in a time of wood smoke and whispered superstitions, they found moments to pause, to sigh, to sit on a sun-warmed step and mutter, "Well, at least the roof didn't fall in today. That's something." And that is something. A small triumph, the kind that doesn't make its way into grand chronicles or epic ballads, but that carries you from one day to the next, through rain-soaked fields and mumbled liturgies, through leaky barns and suspiciously judgmental ducks. So as the village falls into slumber and the moon climbs her ancient ladder, casting silver light across haylofts and half-forgotten wishes, we too drift gently into rest. Let the fire die down. Let the wind rattle the shutters one last time tonight. The soup's cooling. The cows are finally quiet. And for once, just once, the privy didn't collapse. All is well, dear dreamer. All is well.